The days that followed were a mix of sweet and bitter for Sintana. At work, she and Akarat kept things strictly professional around their co-workers, playing their roles like nothing was going on. But in the evenings, it was a different story. Akarat would come by her apartment, and Sintana felt obligated to share her bed with her brother-in-law. After he got what he wanted, he would leave, as if nothing had happened. Hi there, and welcome to our channel. Today, we're diving into another chilling real-life event from around the world. This time, the story takes us to Phitsanulok, Thailand. It's a case that's not only fascinating but also bound to leave you curious. It's all about the tangled mess of someone's personal life. But since this story has a criminal twist, we thought it'd be worth discussing. After all, there's always a lesson to be learned from situations like these. So, what's the full story behind this intriguing case? Let's dig in and find out more. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And hey, if you enjoy this, share it with your friends too. It helps us a lot. Now, let's get into it. So, here's how it all began. There was a man named Komchai, born in 1988 in Phitsanulok, Thailand. He was everything you'd want in a guy: handsome, kind, and smart. In 2006, he landed an international scholarship to study at one of Singapore's top universities, Nanyang Technological University. Life was pretty straightforward for him while living in the dorms. It was there on campus that Komchai met a local girl named Sintana. They hit it off right away and made a great couple. After graduating in 2011, Komchai returned to Thailand, and the two began a long-distance relationship. For about 6 years, they made it work, visiting each other 2 or 3 times a year. Because they were serious about each other, they tied the knot in January 2017, though the process was a bit complicated with all the paperwork. Eventually, Sintana moved to Thailand to live with her husband. Life for the couple was pretty blissful. Although Sintana couldn't work in Thailand, it wasn't an issue because Komchai had a well-paying job at an automotive company. They bought a spacious apartment, which they planned to pay off over 7 years. Komchai's parents had passed away, and his family home was being occupied by his younger brother Akarat and his wife. Since living together didn't feel right, getting their own place was the perfect solution. Things got even better when, in December 2017, their daughter Cecily was born. It brought so much joy to their lives. Their little family lived comfortably, some might even say luxuriously. They often traveled abroad to places like Japan, Bali, and even Turkey. Everything seemed perfect. But then everything changed in March 2020 when the pandemic hit. The global economy took a massive blow, and the company where Komchai worked wasn't spared. Sales plummeted, exports stopped, and even with layoffs, the company couldn't hold on. Eventually, the Phitsanulok branch shut down, and Komchai was indefinitely laid off. His boss did offer him a chance to temporarily transfer to the central office in Bangkok, but Komchai turned it down. He didn't want to leave his wife and daughter alone, especially since Sintana wasn't familiar with the area. For the next couple of months, they relied entirely on their savings. Finding another job in such tough times was nearly impossible. By June 2020, things were still looking grim. The pandemic dragged on, and Komchai was getting more and more anxious about their finances. It wasn't just about food, there were also hefty apartment installments to pay. After a lot of back-and-forth discussions, and a fair share of arguing, the couple finally agreed that Komchai would move to Bangkok to work at his company's headquarters. So he packed up and left, leaving Sintana and little Cecily behind in Phitsanulok. Once again, they found themselves in a long-distance relationship, but they kept in touch regularly through phone calls and video chats. For the first few weeks, things seemed okay, though far from perfect. But soon, anxiety started to creep in for Komchai. He called Sintana and told her he didn't feel comfortable at work. Sales were still terrible, competition among employees was fierce, and the whole atmosphere just didn't sit right with him. Sintana tried her best to reassure him. "Stay focused," she told him. "We need the money." Once things settle down, the Phitsanulok branch will reopen, and you can come back. Reluctantly, he agreed. But just 2 days after that conversation, things took a strange turn. Komchai's calls became less frequent, and eventually, he stopped calling altogether. He would reply to text messages here and there, maybe twice a day, but even that stopped after a while. After 2 weeks of radio silence, his phone number went completely inactive. Worried, Sintana began calling his office, but every time, she got a different answer. One person said, "Oh, Mr. Komchai is out right now." Another claimed, "He doesn't work here anymore." And sometimes they'd even say, "We don't know anyone by that name." It was baffling, but she tried to stay optimistic. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. After all, he'd only been transferred recently. Still, the thought of her husband vanishing into thin air gnawed at her. After a month and a half with no news, she couldn't take it anymore. Determined to find him, she borrowed money from her brother-in-law, Akarat, to cover her travel expenses. Though he was worried too, Akarat had to stay behind to run his business. Initially, Sintana planned to leave her daughter with him, but Sesame cried non-stop, so she brought her along. When they arrived in Bangkok, things only got stranger. At the company office, she was shocked to hear them say that Komchai was never hired back. All the positions were filled, they explained. Confused, she reminded them, but wasn't he transferred here at his boss's request? That's when one of the managers dropped a bombshell. He refused the transfer months ago, and the spot was given to someone else. They did, however, provide an address he had left for future contact. Hoping for answers, she went to the address. It turned out to be a family home where he had rented a room for about a month. The owners told her, "Oh, he left last month and said he was heading back to Phitsanulok because he wasn't feeling well." But that couldn't be true. If he'd returned home, she would have seen him. He hadn't been back in months, and his phone was still disconnected. Desperate, Sintana spent a week in Bangkok, renting a small room and searching for her husband. She checked hospitals, wandered under bridges, and even looked around storefronts, but there was no trace of him. In the end, Akarat urged her to come home, worried something might happen to her and her daughter. With a heavy heart, she returned to Phitsanulok, empty-handed and full of questions. Long story short, when Sintana returned to Thailand, she was lost and unsure how to provide for her 2-year-old daughter, Sesame. She decided to ask her brother-in-law, Akarat, if she could work at his electronics shop. With the approval of his wife, Nataya, Sintana was allowed to take a job as a cashier. Since November 2020, Akarat had also been covering the apartment installments for the place that Komchai and Sintana had shared. He wasn't just doing it so Sintana and her daughter would have a roof over their heads. He was confident his brother would eventually come back, make things right, and pay him back. Everyone believed that Komchai would return eventually, though they assumed he was too embarrassed to show up without a job. But as weeks turned into months, there was still no sign of him. By December, the silence from her husband was weighing heavily on Sintana. The heartbreak of not knowing what had happened to him was unbearable. Was he okay? Was he even alive? And on top of that, she couldn't stop wondering how long she could depend on her in-laws. Nataya, though initially kind, had started making passive-aggressive remarks that left Sintana feeling unwelcome. With the pandemic still restricting flights, returning to Singapore wasn't an option either. Each day, she prayed for a miracle, that her husband would come back, safe and sound. She was ready to face any hardships with him, but as time passed, her hopes began to feel more like unreachable dreams. Then came December 2020, when things took an unsettling turn. Akarat started visiting her apartment more often. At first, it seemed innocent. He'd bring food, offer words of encouragement, and chat to keep her spirits up. But soon, his behavior became inappropriate. He began to touch her and subtly pressure her, dangling promises of financial help, like covering the apartment installments and giving her shopping money. Despite her inner turmoil, Sintana eventually gave in, convincing herself she was doing this for her daughter. She clung to the belief that her husband would return someday and that everything would be okay. But the days that followed were bittersweet. At work, she and Akarat acted professionally, like nothing was going on. Yet in the evenings, he would visit her apartment, and she felt obligated to meet his demands. Afterward, he'd simply leave, as though nothing had happened. Then came January 12, 2021. There was a wedding celebration near Akarat's home, and his wife, Nataya, joined the neighborhood women in the kitchen to help with the cooking. As is often the case, about 10% of the time was spent peeling onions, and the other 90% was spent peeling back the layers of everyone's personal drama. While some women praised Nataya for her husband's thriving business despite the pandemic, one neighbor, Mrs. Sayandeo, had a juicy piece of gossip to share. She lived in the apartment next to Santana and casually mentioned that she often saw Akarat visiting Santana late at night, staying for hours, and leaving around midnight, nearly every day. This, of course, reached Nataya's ears. Though visibly taken aback, she tried to brush it off. "Oh, he's probably just dropping by to check on her," she said. "She works at our shop, after all." But Mrs. Sayandeo wasn't buying it. "Dropping by? At midnight? Every day? That seems like an odd time for business," she quipped, raising an eyebrow. Nataya forced a strained smile and said, "Sometimes there are important matters to discuss, you know." But Mrs. Sayandeo shot back with a sly grin. "Important matters at midnight? Every night. Why not handle that during business hours?" Unable to respond, Nataya awkwardly excused herself and left the group, heading home with her thoughts swirling. Mrs. Sayandeo's comments had planted a seed of suspicion in Nataya's mind. Unable to shake the feeling that something was off, she began dropping by her husband Akarat's electronics store more frequently, keeping an eye on him and Santana. While everything appeared normal on the surface, the nagging doubt remained. One day, Nataya secretly took a spare key to Santana's apartment from the work drawer and made a duplicate. She wanted to see for herself if her husband really spent hours there late at night, as Mrs. Sayandeo had claimed. On January 14th, Nataya decided to investigate. At around 10 p.m., when her husband still hadn't come home, she headed to Santana's apartment. But just as she arrived in the lobby, she saw Akarat leaving the building. She immediately backed off, deciding it was better to catch him red-handed if anything suspicious was going on. Later that night, when Akarat returned home, he casually told her he'd been out drinking beer with friends. That lie only deepened her suspicions. She had seen with her own eyes that he was coming from Santana's apartment. Determined to uncover the truth, she resolved to return the next night. On the night of January 15, 2021, around 11 p.m., Nataya saw Akarat's car parked outside the apartment complex. Certain something was happening, she quietly climbed the emergency stairs to avoid being noticed. Using the duplicate key, she unlocked the door and slipped inside. She headed straight to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and walked towards Santana's bedroom, which was unlocked. What she found confirmed her worst fears. There on the bed were Akarat and Santana in the middle of an intimate moment. Fury and disgust overwhelmed her. Akarat and Santana froze in shock as Nataya burst into the room. She lunged at her husband first, but he managed to jump out of her way. Santana, paralyzed with fear, sat frozen on the bed. Without hesitation, Nataya turned her rage on her, stabbing her in the chest. Akarat quickly restrained his wife and carried her out of the apartment, shouting for help as they reached the corridor. Some neighbors rushed out and managed to hold Nataya back. Meanwhile, Akarat ran back into the apartment, scooped up the injured Santana, and rushed her to the hospital. Their young daughter, Cecily, was left in the care of a neighbor during the chaos. At the same time, other neighbors escorted a furious and hysterical Nataya to the police station. Her anger boiled over, especially because Akarat had chosen to take Santana to the hospital instead of defending her. At the police station, Nataya revealed her long-standing resentment toward Santana. She admitted that she had always been jealous of her beauty and had suspected her of seducing Akarat. However, during questioning, several employees from Akarat's shop testified that it was actually Akarat who had been pursuing Santana for months. When asked why he hadn't made more effort to find his missing brother, Akarat claimed that he believed Komchai wanted to be left alone out of shame for being unemployed. Nataya, however, accused him of deliberately avoiding the search in order to get closer to Sintana. Despite Nataya's accusations, the investigation revealed that Sintana had initially resisted Akarat's advances, but eventually gave in under the pressure of her financial situation. After weeks of treatment, Sintana's condition thankfully improved. However, she was visibly shaken, both traumatized by the incident and ashamed of her actions. When the police later arranged for her and Nataya to meet, Sintana broke down in tears, apologizing profusely to her sister-in-law. She admitted her regret, confessing that she had only gone along with Akarat because she desperately needed financial support to provide for her daughter and pay off the apartment. But Nataya wasn't moved. She remained cold and indifferent throughout the meeting, refusing to acknowledge Sintana's apology. Despite Sintana's attempts to plead for leniency on Nataya's behalf, the legal process moved forward. Prosecutors argued that Nataya had premeditated the attack. They pointed to her actions, duplicating the apartment key, timing her arrival to catch them together, and using a knife she knew was in the kitchen, as evidence of intent. At her trial in the Phitsanulok City High Court in early April 2021, the judge ruled that her actions constituted a planned assault. Although she hadn't brought a weapon with her, her familiarity with the apartment and deliberate actions were enough to support the charge. Nataya's lawyer, however, argued that her motive stemmed from defending her household's honor after the betrayal by her husband and sister-in-law. On April 27, 2021, the court found Nataya guilty of assault and attempted homicide. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison but was eligible for release on bail after serving at least 5 years. Her lawyer didn't stop there, filing a counterclaim against Akarat and Sintana for their misconduct. As a result, both were sentenced to 5 months in prison for their role in the affair. Following the trial, Sintana's mother traveled from Singapore to bring her granddaughter back with her. By January 2022, life had taken another twist. Komchai, who had been missing for over a year and a half, unexpectedly returned to Phitsanulok. His intention? To find Sintana and request a legal separation. As it turned out, during his absence, he had remarried. His new wife, a dancer in Bangkok, had supported him during his struggles and given him the strength to finally return home and face his past. However, by the time he arrived, Sintana had already been released from prison and had moved to Singapore with their daughter. The only person he managed to meet was his brother, Akarat. Their encounter, however, was far from welcoming. Furious at everything that had happened, Akarat kicked him out of the house, declaring that as far as he was concerned, Komchai was gone for good. What lessons can we learn from this story?